If the world of corporate compliance has anything approaching a rock star, it's Hui Chen. Her career includes positions of increasing responsibility in anti-bribery, anti-fraud, and anti-corruption at some of the world's most prominent corporations. Hui Chen has just finished a position as the first ever compliance counsel at the United States Department of Justice and is now a campaigning consultant for better corporate governance in the private sector. As if that weren't enough, Hui Chen is also a divinity school graduate and can bake, fry, and saute just about anything you throw at her after a series of jobs as a line chef in restaurants in Italy. Today, Hui Chen is our guest in the London offices of Control Risks. We're going to talk about crime and punishment, ethics and governance in the United States and around the world. Welcome to the dialogue. A very big welcome to Hui Chen, to the London offices of Control Risks. The weather and the City of London are cooperating perfectly today to provide a wonderful background. It's a delight to have you here. Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Hui Chen, you've just arrived fairly recently from the United States. Do you mind if we just jump in on a question about what the compliance and the enforcement environment is like in the U.S. right now?
I would say it remains relatively unchanged from before, and I think there is a lot of anticipation and uncertainty about what may be happening under the new administration. Things do happen slowly in federal government and in society in general. So I'm not seeing any dramatic changes, but I do sense there's a lot of anxiety and anticipation.
One of the sources of that anxiety is the funding of the fraud and the FCPA divisions at the Department of Justice, right? Funding is under threat, decreasing. What is the impact of that on the enforcement environment or the future and the predictability of the enforcement environment?
I think that is yet to be seen. One of the things that I believe Jeff Sessions had made quite clear is that his focus seems to be more of the traditional guns and drugs and immigration types of issues. Now, in order to accomplish whatever his objectives are in those areas, would that necessitate taking away resources from other parts of justice? I think that we're in the midst of budget season, and that is yet to be seen. That only people internally would know how it's actually allocated. And then there are things that can be done without actually allocating, cutting budget. For example, personnel can be shifted. And so that's not yet happened. We don't know if it's going to happen, but I think that's part of what's feeding into some of that anxiety and speculation.
How much of a signal is this, though? If there's a new type of priority in the Department of Justice under a new Attorney General, how much are we supposed to read into that shift in emphasis, and what's the message being sent to the corporate community?
So I believe I just read that the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had announced that there would be new reviews of the corporate prosecution policies as well as a review of the FCPA pilot program. He has not indicated what the results of those reviews would be. One of the things I've always said, even before I joined Justice, and certainly since I joined and after I left, has been, while I appreciate the importance of companies taking cues and doing their tea leaf reading from what's happening at Justice Department, I think that really should only be so much of what you do. I very much believe in companies need to do what is right for them, in the sense that things that reflect their own values. And keep looking to Justice Department is not looking at your own values. You're looking at someone else's values, and that's going to change from administration to administration. And I think it's important for companies to decide what is important to them and how they want to conduct business and focus on those things.
It's almost impossible to resist doing a little bit of tea leaf reading.
Of course.
I think we all do that. We all want to forecast. And you suggest turning away and looking at your own values as an organization. How do you benchmark that? How do you understand if you're going in the right direction? We always want to compare with what the DOJ tells us to expect.
I think that's a fair question. I think most important, I think one of the things organizations need to do more of is really determining, knowing what their own values are, first of all, and what direction they want to go to. So that's not something that you want to, someone else to tell you which direction to go to. And I think the other, in terms of benchmarking, I personally think, again, benchmarking has its values, but I am much more focused on measuring results. So I like to encourage companies to define their objectives, paint the picture of what success looks like, define what success looks like, and figuring out how to measure that. And if you're doing a program, you want to know this is what this program needs to accomplish. If we're successful, we'll have the following results, and these are the metrics that we're going to use to measure that. So in that sense, you're actually benchmarking against yourself in a very concrete way, and I think that's the way I like to approach it. I think that's something that companies can benefit from as well.
These days, when you've got companies in different sectors with different footprints in different countries with all kinds of varying risk profiles, where do you tell them to set the bar? How high, how low? Where is the golden middle?
I think this is exactly why benchmarking is difficult, right? Because, and this is also why, certainly when I was at Justice, a lot of people say they want more guidance, and my view has always been that Justice, certainly as a prosecuting agency, has given as much guidance as is possible, because every industry, every company is going to have its own risk profile. And I think the most important thing, again, is back to companies knowing what risks they face, because no business is going to be risk-free. That's an impossible goal. So it's determining your own companies what the risks are and what your risk appetite is. Some companies are going to be more willing to take certain risks, and some are going to be less willing. So I think this is a lot more introspection than companies are used to.
I take very much the point that the DOJ is an enforcement organization,
right,
and it's not there to dole out advice or to be a handholder
right,
to the corporate community. But for one more second on the DOJ,
sure,
we're a little bit concerned about brain drain from the organization and the creation of a vacuum inside the enforcement community. That increases the level of unpredictability. Is that a concern that you share? Is that something that, now that you're in the private sector,
right,
that you're also monitoring?
I believe so. The senior leaders in the fraud section that I worked with, as far as I know, none of them are going anywhere, and they're very, very smart and dedicated people with integrity. And I take comfort as a citizen that they're there. I have no reason to believe that they will go. Fraud section is, does have its normal. There are people who have left, but keep in mind, in other times, there are regular departures and entrances as well. So there's the normal flow of people through the revolving door, and that's normal. And so I think the most important part is that the leadership that I worked with, that I have enormous amount of trust in, they're still very much in place. And like I said, as a citizen, I take comfort in that.
Great. Okay, that's reassuring. Thank
Yes.
you very much for that. Having focused on Washington for a little bit, let's broaden our horizons for a second and talk a little bit about the relationship between the enforcement community in the U.S. and secondary enforcers and other countries that are interested in anti-bribery, anti-corruption, anti-money laundering. What's the relationship like between other countries and their enforcement activities and those in the United States?
So clearly, U.S. is increasing its level, has been increasing its level of cooperation with foreign authorities as well as with other federal and state agencies. The interesting perspective on that is actually what I got recently since I left Justice Department, and having been in Brazil and France and Germany.
A couple of countries that you can't not mention in talking about anti-bribery.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's been very interesting to get a sense, certainly from the compliance community, and about how they feel about the U.S. Leadership role in this area. And all three countries have somewhat different reactions. And what I keep wanting to remind people of is that this drive towards not just anti-corruption, but really anti-fraud and just operating with your ethical values in place. That trend is a worldwide trend, and different countries may be at different places, but the movement of the trend, I think, is unmistakable. And U.S. has been at this a little longer than most other countries, so that's why it takes a leadership role in this. Is that going to change? It's certainly possible as other countries really pick up. And in all three countries that I mentioned, I saw a lot of momentum and a lot of interest, which is encouraging to see.
Wow, so that would teach companies to anticipate a certain amount of tightening of anti-bribery, white-collar crime, anti-fraud regimes outside the U.S. and perhaps a kind of nowhere-to-hide environment on the horizon. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I would agree with that.
Okay, interesting. Let's try to go inside the mind of a compliance officer or a chief legal officer, risk managers in the corporate world. How should they be thinking right now? How are they managing unpredictability? How are they managing some of the other topics that you've just touched on outside the United States? Where should their primary area of focus be?
Oh dear. I think that a lot of that is going to focus on their own risk profile. So one of the things that I find surprising is when I was at the DOJ and when companies come in to do their compliance presentation, my typical first question is, can you give me a sense of your company's risk profile? And it was surprising to me how many chief compliance officers or GCs cannot answer that question. And that's concerning. So if you if you're the head of a company and you don't know about the basic operations of your company, where your revenue is coming from, where are your employees, what different functions are they, what are they doing every day, that's really, I don't know how you can begin to manage risk if you don't know what they are. So the most important thing is actually knowing your business. That's where I would start if you're not already there.
We've encountered similar things in the work that we do, and there is the issue of not knowing physically where you are, what you're doing, and the risk that it brings. The second issue is there are companies that don't have a good sense of their institutional pain threshold, if you will. And you can advise them day in and day out, and the advice will be meaningless unless they know where that sits in their company's sort of stomach for risk.
Completely right.
Do you find the same thing?
Completely right.
Yeah.
And I think one of the difficult challenges for compliance is a demanding job, and it's a job that keeps people up at night. And it's very difficult for people to try to emerge from that day-to-day crisis almost and say, I'm going to take some proactive steps and really communicate with my colleagues in the company, whether it's finance or the GC or procurement or the business leadership or the marketing heads, just to get a sense from them, what are they doing? What challenges are they facing? How can I help them? I think those conversations are critically important, but because they don't address any immediate crisis, a lot of us don't find the time to do it. And I do think that's one of the things that we, as compliance professionals, is important to remind ourselves to do, because that's actually where you're going to learn, most likely where the crisis might be.
There must have been times when you were staying up very late at night. There must have been times when you were afraid to ask certain types of questions for fear of what the answer would be. You've been on both sides of that equation now.
Yes.
For compliance officers who are also nodding and saying, I'm up late at night and I've got issues that I really don't know how to approach, what would your advice be?
So I used to tell my team that every day I try to make a list of 5 to 10 things I must do that day, with the recognition that if I get 2 of them done, I'd be lucky. So you got to know what those 2 are.
Yeah.
And I think, once again, it's the putting out fire nature of the job that is so difficult for you to step away from. And because there are fires to be put out. There are people who are knocking on your door and ringing your phones, and you have 300 emails that you haven't answered, and there's probably some fire buried in there as well. But carving out, just making sure, these are the two things today I'm going to carve out to make sure I do. I think that's the hardest discipline, and that would be my advice.
Okay, we're going to drill down just a little bit deeper. You're doing a boot camp for control risks, a compliance boot camp for the corporate governance community. Hui Chen, what is the drop and give me 50 of compliance? And what's the first thing you've got to do to have the basics in place?
Learning your business, learning your values, and getting the information to help people act on their values.
That's pretty solid. You don't have to think too much about how to get that across. Is there any particular homework you would give corporate governance professionals to do these days?
I would start with the risk profiling. So I would start with learning, trying to assess how much you know about your own business. And again, that's something that we all think we know somewhat. But I think really actually drilling down into it and saying, when was the last time I had a conversation with the head of marketing and know what they're up to? When was the last time I visited with our regional CEO about what's happening there? Thinking about those conversations, that's the most important. And I think the other thing is really, back to what we talked about, defining objectives and figuring out measurements and KPIs.
Hui Chen, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.